America, you don't look a day over 249. Happy birthday, baby! Welcome, welcome, welcome to American Esoterica. If history class gives you the fireworks show, this is the epic bunch of bursts that makes the grand finale. The essential stuff in between, the personalities, events, and other ephemera that shape our history and culture. I'm Brian Powers. This is it. We made it! No, I don't mean the fact that this is the 100th episode of American Esoterica. We've reached the day when, 250 years earlier, the founders finalized but didn't all sign the document that explained the momentous vote that they had taken a full 2 days earlier, which is the thing that they thought we'd actually celebrate. But wait, this all sounds familiar. That's right. I told this story in the very first episode of the show. Oh no. Am I repeating myself? Is there nothing new to say? Have all the stories been told? Surely not. I mean, we haven't even discussed how entrenched some American institutions are. For instance, Harvard was founded here in 1636. Isaac Newton wouldn't publish his Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica until 1687, which means the good old American prestige school Harvard University is actually older than calculus. The College of William and Mary would come along in 1693 and spawn a pair of roommates, Thomas and John. Yes, Thomas Jefferson. No, not John Adams. John Tyler. Now, something is scratching at the back half of your brain because that name sounds familiar, but no. This John Tyler was not the same guy as President John Tyler. You know, that guy with the grandson who just died? That guy was John Tyler Jr. Jefferson's roommate was John Tyler Sr., a completely different guy. And also the future president's father, and the great-grandfather to the guy who just died. Either there were a lot of crazy coincidences in the colonial era, or, hear me out, our founders and their successors came from backgrounds of elite privilege and just naturally emerged from the same circles. Speaking of presidential fathers, let's solve a contrived word problem. The president and his son sit on a bench. The president leaves the room. Then several years later, the president enters the room and sits down next to the same man on the bench. Someone asks the president who is the man accompanying him, and the president responds, "He's my father." What is the man's name? His name is John Scott Harrison, and he has the distinction of being proof that talent skips a generation. John Scott Harrison has the distinction of being both the son and the father of the president. The presidents being William Henry Harrison and Benjamin Harrison, respectively. I mean, how do you live up to that? Speaking of disappointing and awkward transitions, the name Henry reminded me that I wanted to backtrack to the Revolutionary era again. Look, we all know that we kind of shine on the idea that the Declaration of Independence means that all men are created equal, etc., 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 when the words were a little bit disingenuous coming from the pen of an unapologetic enslaver. But if we're really in the mood to root out some more hypocrisy, should we look no further than Mr. Patrick "Give me liberty or give me death" Henry? Patrick Henry envisioned a very different take on government. For one thing, he was pretty much in favor of an established national religion and government funding for such. He and Jefferson fought bitterly over the concept, with Jefferson's vision ultimately winning the day. But it was something much more personal that I'm going to attempt to trick you with before revealing that it was all a misdirect. And how am I just now realizing that this guy sounds like he has two first names? Patrick Henry's first wife, Sarah, was a childhood sweetheart. They were married when he was 18 and she was 16. But if you think that sounds young when applying modern sensibilities, know that they also thought it was a bit young back then, too. Patrick and Sarah immediately got down to it. And something about having 6 freaking children finally pushed her too far. Okay, it was possibly some form of postpartum depression, but mental illness took hold. Her outbursts were so strong that she had to be frequently restrained in the precursor to a straitjacket. Sarah was considered a danger to herself and others. So what did Mr. Liberty do? He locked her in the basement until she ultimately took her own life. Way to go, creep. There's a classless joke here about choosing death when not given liberty, but I'm too dumb to not make it. So there. Massive hypocrite Patrick Henry wouldn't even give his own wife liberty. But let's hold up in our smug moral disapprobation, because what Patrick Henry did was actually, for the time, an act of love. Mental illness wasn't well understood in the late 18th century. The treatments for it were barbaric by our standards. A new and revolutionary place, Eastern State Hospital, had just opened up that applied groundbreaking techniques such as bleeding, blistering, water torture, and more in a brutal prison-like environment. This was actually a tremendous leap forward, though, because they actually attempted to treat mental illness rather than imprisoning or casting out as sinful those who experienced it. The choices for 1774 were slim, and Patrick had personally visited the hospital and seen how the patients were treated. He refused to let that happen to his wife. They chose the more compassionate option. She had her own room in their basement with a good amount of sunshine, and she could be home among her family. She passed away in 1775. In late August 1776, the revolution wasn't going well, and it was specifically not going well in New York City. Word came down that the British were about to make a move on the city. In organizing its defense, General George Washington had made one crucial error. Despite the obvious concentration of British forces arriving on Long Island, he divided his forces between there and Manhattan, where he actually expected them to attack. This left the Continental forces severely underpowered in the face of the actual main British attack on Long Island. The British attacked them from the front, while Hessians attacked from the rear, turning their position into a kill zone. Luckily for the Continental soldiers, they had among them the 1st Maryland Regiment. This unit consisted of not just your standard issue soldiers, but also the scions of prominent Maryland and Delaware families. Because they were well-bred, they were also well-funded, and therefore well-equipped with such fancy items as working bayonets, for instance. Their escape route lay through 80 yards of marshland, where the British could pick them off if left unguarded. Enter Lord Stirling. That's the name that General William Alexander gave himself, and it was on Long Island where he earned the right to be called whatever the hell he wanted. Seeing the situation before him, Lord Stirling organized a rear guard of around 400 of the Maryland and Delaware soldiers to cover the bulk of the retreating forces from British fire. As the Hessians and British closed in on them, the Maryland 400, as they would come to be known, did something incredible. The British were firing from a well-fortified position inside a large stone building called, well, the Stone House. It would have been crazy to attack that position. So, that's what the Maryland 400 did. They advanced on the Stone House with muskets and bayonets, taking brutally heavy fire before retreating and regrouping and advancing again and again. It was a suicide mission, and they took heavy casualties. Each time, as they were pushed back, they would have to advance again over their fallen compatriots. All in all, at least 256 soldiers died in the attack on the Stone House, and over 100 were captured, and even many of those died from disease and mistreatment in British prisoner of war camps. Only a few dozen of the Maryland 400 survived to eventually rejoin the American line, Lord Stirling among them. Rather than surrender to the British, he escaped them to surrender to the Hessians. It would be one of the highest casualty rates of any Revolutionary War battle, with over 60% losses. But the Maryland 400 accomplished something unbelievable. Every bullet fired in their direction wasn't fired in the direction of their retreating allies. By focusing the full attention of the British and Hessians, the Maryland 400 gave the larger forces the chance to escape, and it also prevented the British from advancing. And if they had advanced, there was a strong possibility that Washington and his unprepared forces would have been captured, likely bringing the rebellion in the colonies to a swift end just a month past their Declaration of Independence. If you value your independence today, Thank the Maryland 400. Of course, once we got the American experiment up and really rolling after a false start or so, our founders were tasked with creating an entirely new system of government from whole cloth, including a brand spanking new Bill of Rights, which were a completely original concept and definitely not influenced by anything that came before, like, let's say, a hypothetical English Bill of Rights that was signed into law just about 7 months and 100 years earlier. Surely no, right? Surely the former British subjects didn't look to secure the very same rights they already had before the revolution, right? Sorry to break it to you, but yes, we 100% cheated off of England's paper. Among the rights guaranteed under the other Bill of Rights are the right to petition the king for redress of grievances, a semi-right to bear arms, a stab at freedom of speech, a right to trial by jury, and freedom from having to quarter soldiers, which is confusing because isn't that exactly what they did in our colonial era that led to our Third Amendment? Maybe the most egregious and shameless copying wound up in our Eighth Amendment, which reads, "Excessive bail ought not to be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted." Wait, sorry. That was actually the English Bill of Rights version. Our version reads, "Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted." They changed 2 words and called it good, which is how you file a middle school book report, and apparently create a new system of fundamental rights. Nothing much happened in the next few decades, obviously, save for how George Washington decided to spend his retirement quietly becoming the nation's largest distiller. His farm manager convinced him in 1797, the year Washington left office, to add distilling as a side business as a natural complement to his farming and milling operations. In 1799, his distillery produced, get this, nearly 11,000 gallons of whiskey and rye, since that'll be the year that he died. To put that into context, the average working Virginia distillery that year produced around 650 gallons. So there was a lot of booze in early America, which might explain the ideas of a man named John Cleves Symmes. In 1818, Symmes published a declaration that the center of the earth was hollow, and he proposed expeditions to where he believed the entrances were, the North and South Poles. There, he believed, were large openings that would lead to the interior of the planet, and possibly a parallel race of humans that we're going to point and laugh at by referring to them as mole people. But as with many crazy people, Symmes was charismatic and persistent. He even went before Congress twice to ask for funding for an expedition, and even crazier, 25 congressmen voted in favor of it the second time around. As the magnetic often do, Symmes attracted a raft of followers, among them a man named Jeremiah Reynolds, a former newspaper editor who gave it all up to join the cult of Symmes as he hit the lecture circuit. Reynolds wised up after a few years, but the idea of a polar expedition never left him. He lobbied and eventually convinced President John Quincy Adams, who agreed to fund a polar expedition due to his zeal for exploration. The go-ahead was given, the team was ready, and everything was set. And then it all fell apart. Adams was defeated in the election of 1828 by Andrew Jackson, who wasn't keen on exploring Arctic tundras. Which is a shame, because it would have been great to have established diplomatic relations with the mole people early on, before the uprising of 1852. Mole people. Where was I? Oh yeah, 1828. Just 13 years before President John Tyler, the son of Thomas Jefferson's college roommate, vetoed the Second National Bank. Since it was a boring old banking bill that he vetoed, obviously people responded in a calm and unassuming manner, right? Nope. 2 full waves of protests showed up on the literal lawn outside the White House on the night of August 18th, 1841, firing guns in the air, chanting, "Down with the veto," and hanging Tyler in effigy. Tyler and his family were alone in the house with no security, and the event rattled them enough to hire guards for the White House going forward. The reason for the threatening protests was simple. The bill Tyler vetoed was championed by Henry Clay, the powerful Speaker of the House and a member of Tyler's own party. Not only that, it was considered a desperate measure to stave off the further collapse of an economy in crisis. Tyler believed the bill to be unconstitutional, bucking his party and the bill's popularity to veto it according to Jeffersonian philosophy of government. The fallout didn't end with the violent protests. Tyler was eventually kicked out of his own party over the veto, the only president to have that happen. While John Tyler was having a rough time in the presidency, his immediate predecessor, Martin Van Buren, was reaping the consequences of his own veto. In 1842, Van Buren was on a tour of the countryside outside of Indianapolis, traveling along a stretch of road in a place called Plainfield. The road was pretty terrible, and that was no accident. During his term, Van Buren vetoed a bill that would fund improvements to the national road, a rough, barely passable stretch of dirt that Van Buren now found himself on. The road was so bad and in need of repair that a tree had fallen in the middle of the road, creating two makeshift paths around it. The carriage driver knew what was coming and sped up, choosing the rougher of the two paths. The speed of the carriage produced the desired effect, and the carriage finally tipped, dumping Van Buren into a large patch of mud. He was forced to walk into town covered head to toe in mud, a victim of his own political actions. For his trouble, the people of Plainfield tipped the carriage driver a fine new silk hat for executing the planned prank exactly to the last detail. Maybe presidential vetoes aren't so boring after all. But the nation didn't need any more excitement in the lead up to the Civil War. That lead up was heavily influenced by a group that you've probably never heard of, but their effect on the nation turned out to be undeniable. As tensions flared in the not at all pivotal election year of 1860, a Kentucky abolitionist named Cassius Marcellus Clay gave such a rousing speech in Hartford, Connecticut, that it inspired a movement. Young working-class men were looking to join the fray, and Clay gave them a spark that lit the fuse by reminding them just how effective slavery was at concentrating power in the South. In case you needed a reminder, the Three-Fifths Compromise in the Constitution allowed Southern slaveholders to count 60% of their enslaved population for purposes of representation in the House of Representatives. Since this portion of the population didn't legally vote, all of that extra representation went to the people who desperately wanted slavery to continue. Add to that the advantage that rural states already have the Electoral College, and you begin to understand how the 400,000 slaveholding Americans effectively controlled national policy for a population of 31 million. After Cassius Clay spoke, a few young men decided to join his movement in a march to protest slavery. They brandished torches, and one of them quickly fashioned a makeshift black cape to hide where he spilled oil on his coat. His fellow proto-revolutionaries liked it so much that they made capes of their own, and then the five of them joined Clay's march with black capes and torches. A march organizer spotted the young men and moved them to the front of the parade. The black capes and torches transformed instantly from hastily created parade wear into somewhat actual uniforms. The cape-clad marchers in front also bore the brunt of an attack by pro-slavery agitators trying to disrupt the parade. But the anti-protesters didn't count on the brawlers underneath the capes, forcing them back. The parade ended, everyone went to bed, and a young columnist for the Hartford Courant stayed up to pen his thoughts on the parade, saying that it seemed like the new Republican Party was finally wide awake. And that's how a movement begins. Those 5 young clerks realized they were onto something and adopted the name Wide Awakes. A week later, they held their first organizational meeting with 36 of their closest friends. They organized and rallied and built out their movement. And soon more and more young men made more black capes and carried torches to more protests. A certain kind of hat joined the uniform, and a logo emerged with a wide open eye. Soon, there were 500 of them. Then, something even more incredible happened. The Wide Awakes met Abraham Lincoln. He was still a relative unknown facing an uphill battle, and he was in Hartford on a breakneck stumping tour trying to gain recognition. After giving his stump speech and entering his carriage for the ride back to his hotel, he noticed that the conveyance was surrounded by young men in black capes carrying torches, and they escorted him all the way back to his hotel. The Wide Awake Revolution, meanwhile, continued to spread. It wasn't just a youth political organization or voter drive. It was also a militia when it needed to be. like when Republican events were disrupted by Democratic mobs. They were tough, and they soon started military drills as an organization. Where there was chaos, the Wide Awakes projected order. And they didn't do so bad with the ladies either. Soon, local Wide Awakes clubs were springing up all over New England and beyond. And the real work of organization began to bear fruit, as the clubs soon numbered in the hundreds. The Republican convention that nominated Lincoln for the top job provided the largest viral spread of the Wide Awakes movement. By the end of that summer, there were an estimated 100 to 250,000 members, making it one of the largest mass movements in American history by percentage of the population. It also terrified the South, which saw it as a militant army that threatened them. On Election Day, over 81% of eligible voters turned out, one of the highest turnouts ever recorded. Lincoln waited for results inside his office next to a telegraph, safe inside his citadel while a phalanx of uniformed Wide Awakes stood guard around the building. They delivered for him that day too. In a four-way race, Lincoln captured a nearly 40% plurality of the popular vote, but an eye-popping and wildly ironic 3/5 of the Electoral College. It's not just a possibility. It's exceedingly likely that the outcome was due to the organizing of the Wide Awakes, who handed a newly energized youth vote to the candidate. When Lincoln made his way to give his inaugural speech, hundreds of plainclothes Wide Awakes were there to accompany him. They also spurred the South into action. The new Republican leaders, they insisted, would look and act more like the street-brawling Wide Awakes than the stately calm Lincoln tried to project. When the time came to secede, the Wide Awakes were definitely on their minds. And when the Civil War burst forth, the Wide Awakes became eager recruits, happy to turn their pretend militarism into actual war experience. The movement died out with the war, but it became a pattern for all the movements to follow, and it's still a foundational organizational template even today. And to think, one of the most consequential elections in history, a Republican president was delivered into office by a mass of people who were, by their own recognition, what one might consider to be woke. The South, of course, seceded, and soon would come the first shots at Fort Sumter. The federal fort at the time was commanded by Major Robert Anderson, who had been an artillery instructor at West Point. It's reasonable to wonder then what he thought about the aim of the first shots to be fired at the fort, since they came from Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard, Major Anderson's favorite student, firing at his favorite professor. In the waning years of the Civil War, the North won two very decisive victories and two very unusual sea battles. In the first, the infamous Confederate raiding ship CSS Alabama had put into port for a badly needed refit in June of 1864. This ship had been the bane of the Union for 2 years, wreaking havoc on commercial shipping in the North. So when news that it was laid up in the port reached the USS Kearsarge, the Union ship immediately steamed in the Alabama's direction and blockaded the port. The captain of the Alabama sent a suggestion to the captain of the Kearsarge. Hey, give me a few days to get ready, then we can just have a ship-on-ship duel, Hamilton-Burr style. The opposing captain agreed, and 4 days later, the captain of the Alabama only needed an hour to figure out what a dumb idea he had proposed, as he watched his prized ship sink below the waves, a victim of the Union's superior firepower. Pretty much the exact same thing played out in October of that year as well. The Confederate sloop of war, the CSS Florida, needed a resupply and repairs and put into port. They didn't know that the USS Wachusett was quietly tailing them nearby. The Wachusett blockaded the port, the Confederates got nervous and moved their ship closer to shore, and for some reason, they brought a good chunk of the crew ashore for leave. That made it all the easier for the Wachusett to attack the Florida in the dead of night, capture the scant remaining crew, attach a tow line, and steal the ship right out of the harbor. Both are fun examples of Union ships kicking butt, but that isn't what made the battles unusual. These battles stand out as they're the only battles of the Civil War not fought in the United States. The Alabama had been in port in France and was sunk in the English Channel. The Florida was enjoying a relaxing break from the fighting in the southern enclave of Brazil, and the attack on the Confederates created an international incident that led to the captain of the Wachusett receiving a court-martial. The end of the Civil War came symbolically with the passage and ratification of the 13th Amendment, which every state in existence at the time would eventually ratify, most of them happening within a few years. There were a few holdouts, however. Delaware, for some reason, didn't ratify until 1901, and it took Kentucky a shamefully long time to follow suit, ratifying in the bicentennial year of 1976. But the truly ignoble prize goes to Mississippi, which seemed to reluctantly attempt to ratify in 1995. I say attempt because they screwed up the paperwork so badly that they didn't notice they had actually failed to ratify the amendment until the year 2013. Alright, 1865 to 2013 is a pretty big gap to leap, and it misses out on some historical items, such as the time that future Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor dated future Supreme Court Justice William Rehnquist while they were still in law school. Rehnquist was notable himself for being somewhat of a wildly cynical selection for the court, considering that his main role prior to the court was as a prosecutor digging up dirt on Nixon's ideological foes on the Supreme Court so he could have them impeached. Someday, someone will point out how the 2016 and 2024 presidential elections both featured the only female candidates to date to receive a major party nomination for the very top of the ticket, and both lost to the same opposing candidate. That candidate would become only the second president in history to serve non-consecutive terms when he was inaugurated in 2025. And that brings us, finally, to 2026. What will history say about this year? What odd or interesting pieces of historical trivia will make some random middle-aged dude's podcast years, decades, or even centuries from now? Maybe it's best not to speculate for the moment. Maybe it's time to turn off your device, go for a walk outside, and leave the wondering about whether history will find our 250th year to be pivotal, or at least interesting, to future generations. For now, ignore the pundits and prognosticators, the ne'er-do-wells and naysayers, and the hacks and the hucksters, and just hope that someday you'll find it, that rainbow connection, alongside the lovers, the dreamers, and me. This has been American Esoterica. All sounds are made by me, Brian Powers. Did I get it wrong? Did I get it right? Just want to talk about how dropping a massive 100th episode on the 250th birthday of America is probably a good way to cap off an era of a podcast. And a nice long indefinite pause might be in order. Maybe. More on that later. Either way, drop me a note. The address is yell@americanesoterica.com. More information on the show can be found at americanesoterica.com. Thank you for listening, and on its 250th birthday, God bless America.